Hi, everyone. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to go ahead and join the Zoom room. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. This is our webinar on our new state report cards, Making Strides 2022. I'm Michelle Lieberman. I'm the Consulting and Program Support Director here at the FACTSHEETS Partnership, and I'll be your webinar moderator today, as well as one of the presenters. We're really excited to be sharing these updated report cards with you. If you're new to Safe Routes Partnership, we are a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and in everyday life. We're working to improve the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. Everyone is going to be on mute today, but the chat box is open. We welcome you to put your questions and interact with each other through the chat box. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to drop them in as we go along as things come up. And if you are joining us, you can either join us via computer or via phone. And if you're having issues with audio on one, I would recommend switching over to the other. So today I'm joined by Marisa Jones, our Director of Policy and Partnerships here at the Safe Routes Partnership, and also one of the co-authors of this report. We're going to start today by giving an overview of the report cards in the report. Then we're going to dive into the four core topic areas that we cover and look in depth in more to how we measure each state's strength in terms of those areas and those core topic areas. After each core topic area, we'll provide a summary of some of our findings and reflections. So to give you an overview of the report, it is something that we've been preparing since 2016. And our overall goal with these state report cards is to provide a snapshot of how supportive each state is in terms of walking, bicycling, and physical activity for children and adults. We prepared our state report cards in 2016. That was our first round, and we've updated them every other year since then. And if you've been following along, our 2022 state report cards are very similar in format to 2020. We didn't make a whole lot of changes in terms of the organization or big changes in the indicators. But we really use these report cards to both acknowledge the strengths in each state and let advocates and state governments and community members understand how their state is doing in comparison to like the great potential we really have that comes through policy and state level supports for active, healthy living. This project is done in partnership with the YVUSA and with funding from CDC. So to give you a little bit of what the report includes, we have a background section that includes research on why physical activity, walking, and bicycling matter. We go through our overall rationale for creating state report cards, and then we have really detailed explanations of the scoring, the core topic areas, and each indicator. And then, of course, we have the report cards for each state themselves. At the end of the report, we have reflections and comparisons to previous scores. We have some maps illustrating our key findings, and we have appendices with a lot more detailed information. So a lot to dig into there. So like I said, we didn't make a whole lot of changes since 2020 in terms of the report card's overall structure. We removed a couple of indicators where we were finding that they were just less relevant or there was less data available. One related to the NACNO design guides and one related to state physical activity staffing. And we also added some new indicators, one looking at how states set aside other federal non-transportation alternatives funding for active transportation. We have an indicator on whether or not the state has adopted a statewide Safe Routes to School plan or incorporated Safe Routes to School into another statewide plan. And then we had some minor adjustments to scoring for some other indicators. So you might be wondering, where is the state report cards? Where can I find it? It's on our website. And if you scroll down to the bottom of our homepage on saferoutespartnership.org, you'll see this banner. And once you click on that, you'll go to a map and you'll be able to download each individual state report card sheet from here, as well as the full report and all of the appendices and other associated materials. So our scoring for the report cards is a little bit different. We don't use an A to F scale because we really want this to be asset-based. We have 27 indicators across 4 topic areas. Each of those indicators is individually scored, and we have a maximum of 200 points. So for each core topic area, there is a numerical score and also a grade. And then we also have an overall score and grade for each state. Our grading categories recognize each state's accomplishments, as well as there's always room for improvement. So we go from lacing up being the lowest score grade category to building speed being the highest. Let's walk through one of the report cards. We're going to use New Jersey as an example. And this was one of the states that got a score in the highest grading category of building speed. So at the top right here, you'll see the overall grade. Right below it, you'll see the overall number of points out of 200 as a reminder. Here on the left, we show each of those 4 core topic areas. So the first one here is complete streets and active transportation policy and planning. That's a mouthful. Under each of those core topic areas, we have broken it down into subtopics. And then in the middle here, we have each of those 27 individual indicators. So for each of those individual indicators, on the right, we show the number of points the state received, as well as the number of points that indicator was out of. And then it gets summed up down here to show that core topic area score. And this little bar shows the grade for that core topic area. So to give you an idea of what it looks like across the country, this is the map that shows the overall grades for each state. We had 12 states in the lacing up, the bottom grading category, and 4 states in the building speed category. That means most states continue to be in the middle. They've taken some significant action to support physical activity, walking and biking, but there's also considerable room for improvement. Definitely want to highlight that in 2022, 4 states were in the highest category of building speed. And New Jersey and Massachusetts achieved this level for the first time. Overall, we saw a shift in the total number of points across the US shift upward, which was a good sign. The average in 2020 was 80 points out of 200, and that went up to 82.7 points in 2022. So I'm going to cover the first core topic area and delve into that a little bit more. We will start at the beginning with complete streets and active transportation policy and planning. Here's a map showing the scores just for that core topic area. We saw an upward shift in the scores in this core topic area as well, which is really exciting to see. We had 17 states in that lacing up category, 11 in the next category, 15 in the making strides category, which is the darker green here, and 8 in the highest category of building speed. So this suggests that more states are recognizing the importance of complete streets and active transportation policies and plans and putting things into place. And also that there's more examples for other states to draw from and really inform their own efforts. So in each of the core topic areas, we are going to look at a specific state as an example and talk through the different indicators, what the scoring means, and review the areas where this particular state can excel, has excelled, and can also improve. For this first one, we're going to look closer at Florida, which had a total score of 28 out of 40 possible points in this core topic area, landing it in the second best category of making strides. So you can see here the two subtopics, complete streets policies and active transportation goals and planning. And I'll step into those a little bit more. At Complete Streets, if you're not familiar with them, these are state policies that ensure new construction and renovation of streets create streets that are safe, comfortable, and convenient for everyone who's using them. So folks walking, biking, taking transit, driving, etc. So right here, Florida has adopted a complete streets policy, and then we also have the strength of their complete streets policy. We use the National Complete Streets Center Coalition's scoring rubric to score those policies to identify how strong they are. So the next subtopic in here is active transportation goals and planning. Here we're looking for whether or not the state has adopted public commitments to progress and provide accountability. So have they adopted a goal to specifically increase the number of folks in their state walking and biking? This is often found within some sort of other state plan, a bicycle and pedestrian plan, a highway safety plan, a sustainability plan. A variety of other plans can have this goal. And then also whether or not the state has created a statewide active transportation or bicycle or pedestrian plan. So Florida here has adopted a goal to increase walking and biking. They've also adopted state plans to address both pedestrians and bicyclists. And the information for these two particular indicators come from surveys and information that the League of American Bicyclists collects from each state. So some reflections from this core topic area. In looking at the changes from 2020 to 2022, that we had two states revise their policies and really strengthen what they were. So California and South Carolina, really want to commend them for having these new complete streets policies. 36 states overall have a complete streets policy of some sort. And we look at whether these are provided as legislation or through a Department of Transportation policy. And so there's actually 8 states who have both, which is great, and they got the full points. 10 states have a legislative complete streets policy, and 18 states have it through their DOT. And then in terms of the second core topic area of the goals and planning, 17 states have goals for increasing both walking and biking. This is actually down from 20 states who had these goals in 2020. And then in terms of pedestrian and bicycle or active transportation plans, this has actually gone up. So 33 states have a bicycle or pedestrian plan. Most states include both, and this is up from 31 states in 2020. So I'm going to turn it over to Marisa to talk about federal and state active transportation funding.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So yeah, we are going to turn now to the second core topic area. When we look at a map of the results, we see that we have a pretty even split of states in each of the 4 scoring categories. And there are states with ranges of scores spread throughout the country. So it's not like, oh, one region is really excelling at this. We have high performers in this core topic area all across the country. And generally from 2020 to 2022, we saw the scores for this core topic area improve. And when I look at this map, I'm really inspired to see that in all regions of the country, there are states in the highest scoring category, that dark blue building speed. So we'll look at New Jersey for this section, which landed in the top category with a total score of 61 out of a total of 75 possible points. When you look at this core topic area, you'll see that there are 2 subtopics, and we'll go over each of them in a little more detail in the following slides. And when you look at your own state report card, make sure you're looking also at the full report for the specifics on the points for each of these indicators. So in the first section, we score states for how they're implementing the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program. This section has remained relatively unchanged since 2018. But this year we did add one new indicator, as Michelle mentioned at the beginning, and this new indicator is intended to reward states that dedicate federal funding that is not transportation alternatives program funding on walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. I also really want to make note that the state report cards score states on their past year's stewardship of these funds. And moving forward, some of these indicators have changed as a result of the new bipartisan infrastructure law. So I just want to make note of that as you look at your scores for this year and contemplate actions for the future. Also, really hope that you are already aware of the Transportation Alternatives Program, which we refer to by the acronym TAP. But if you're not, just a quick primer, it is a program that was created by Congress in 2012 when they merged together 3 separate programs that support safe routes to school, bicycling, and walking. And it is Transportation Alternatives is the leading source of federal funds for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. When this report card was made, states received anywhere from $2 million to $80 million a year for the Transportation Alternatives Program. But I'll flag for you that those dollar amounts have increased by 60% with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Okay, so now let's talk more in detail about the scoring specifically. So the federal government makes the funding available to states, but it's up to state DOTs to get the funding out the door through a competitive process. The 3 indicators in the yellow box assess the 3 really critical steps in turning transportation alternatives funding into improvements on the ground that we like to see, like sidewalks, crosswalks, trails. So the first indicator looks at transfers. Before the bipartisan infrastructure law passed, states were allowed to transfer up to half of their TAP money to things that didn't benefit walking, biking, and safe routes to school. So things like roads and bridge projects, rather than keeping it all for walking and biking. We discourage states from doing this as it diverts money away from active transportation. So states are docked points for this indicator based on the amount of funds transferred. New Jersey scored a 5 out of 10 here because they have transferred less than 10% of TAP funds over the life of the program. The second step is that a state has to hold a competition to award these projects. And the goal of this is to let local governments, schools, and nonprofits pursue funding for active transportation projects. New Jersey got a 10 out of 10 here because they have competed out and awarded at least 9 years worth of transportation alternatives program dollars to local communities. Then the third step here is that states have to obligate the funds. So that means helping the project get through the contracting and regulations so that it can actually get built. And New Jersey got an 8 out of 10 here because they have obligated at least 70% of the funds. So now moving on to the 3 indicators in the yellow box, we look at how states make sure that funding is getting to where it's most needed. There are 3 key aspects here that we looked at. So first of all, states can make it easier to get funds where they're needed most by adding equity considerations to how the funds are dispersed. For example, they might give extra points to applicants coming from low-income neighborhoods or setting aside funding for these types of applications. In New Jersey's case, they provide extra consideration for projects in census tracts with higher percentage of Title VI, environmental justice, limited English proficiency, and individuals with disabilities. So we scored New Jersey a 5 out of 5 on this indicator. Another barrier for lower income communities trying to pursue these federal funds is that the Transportation Alternatives Program only covers 80% of the project cost. So it requires a local match. We know that this is often difficult for lower income and rural communities to make that match, to have that local money, which then prevents them applying. New Jersey got a 5 out of 5 here because they use toll credits to pay the matching costs for transportation alternatives projects, that locals don't need to make that match. And then the third thing that we look at here is what kind of support the state provides to applicants. Do they provide workshops? Do they provide grant writing assistance? And again, this is particularly important for lower income communities, smaller communities, rural communities that may lack planning and grant writing staff. New Jersey has a unique program called the Transportation Alternatives Set Aside Design Guidance Program that makes consulting engineering services available to assist local communities with the development of plans, specifications, and estimates for their transportation alternatives projects. And for communities in New Jersey applying for Safe Routes to School funding specifically, they provide one-on-one application assistance and workshops. And so this is another one where New Jersey got a perfect score, 5 out of 5 points. Then the last indicator that we look at here is the new one that we talked about. So while transportation alternatives is the predominant source of federal funding for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school, active transportation projects are actually broadly eligible for other surface transportation funding programs. So TAP is specifically for these and some other uses, but they can be funded through a number of other federal funding sources. And so this indicator assesses whether a state dedicates federal funds besides the Transportation Alternatives Program for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. If a state is spending money on safe routes to school, walking, and bicycling that they could spend on something else, it conveys their commitment to and that they value active transportation. And New Jersey got a 5 out of 5 here because in addition to using toll credits as the match for transportation alternatives, they also use some of their state planning and research funds for their Safe Routes to School program. Okay, so the second sub-indicator within this core topic area shifts from looking at federal funding for walking, biking, and safe routes to school to state funding. And when we talk about state funding, we are specifically interested in non-federal money. So states generating their own revenue and deciding to spend that on walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. This is the second year that we have included this indicator. 2020 was the first year that we did that. Within this subtopic area, we look at 3 considerations. If there is state money, how much, and whether the state provides special consideration for high-need communities in spending that state money. I want to just give the caveat that identifying sources of state funding is an imperfect science, as each state does this differently. It's not as tidy as the Transportation Alternatives Program, where it's this one federal source of funding. And we also know that at the state level, states generally braid together a variety of funding sources to pay for walking and bicycling. So I just want to tell you how we decided what to count. For the purpose of the state report cards, we included any dedicated active transportation funding that was passed or in place within the past 2 calendar years, so starting with January of 2020. And we also reached out to states to verify the data, and if a state could clearly summarize its state funding that they awarded to active transportation projects per year, we included that funding as well. So we'll continue to look at New Jersey for this one. This section has 25 points available. The first indicator assesses both a binary, does a state have funding, yes or no? And it also assesses whether this funding is one time or whether it's ongoing. So states get funding for having any money at all, but the highest number of points for dedicated funding on an ongoing basis is because we know that transportation projects take a while to plan for, and so having this dedicated stream of funding on a recurring basis helps communities and states plan for investing in active transportation. New Jersey's doing great in this regard. They earned all 10 points because they have dedicated funding on an ongoing basis, which really signals their continued commitment to supporting walking and bicycling. The second indicator awards points based on the amount of funding spent on walking and bicycling per capita. So determining the best method of comparing funding amounts between states is super challenging due to differences in population, density, economic strength, underlying infrastructure, topography, maintenance. It could go on and on. And so in order to provide a meaningful and manageable comparison, we assess the amount of annual transportation funding provided per capita. So when we added together the total amount that New Jersey dedicates to walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school and dividing it by the state's total population, it comes out to 37 cents per person, which earned them a 3 out of 10, which suggests there's some room for improvement in this indicator. And just so you know the scale, to receive the full 10 points on this indicator, a state needs to be spending $3 per person. And if that doesn't sound like a lot of money for you, another point of comparison is that the average state spending per capita on highways is $558. The third indicator in this section looks at whether states are prioritizing high-need communities with state funding that they have available. New Jersey, again, did great on this indicator, 5 out of 5 points, because they award in scoring projects with this state funding. New Jersey Department of Transportation awards extra points to what they call urban aid communities and the School Development Authority. And we know that adding points is a meaningful way of prioritizing high-need communities based on research that Auntie Craddock led, the Harvard School of Public Health, that assesses mechanisms for prioritizing high-need communities. Okay, so we'll move on to reflections for this section. So overall, in terms of federal funding, the average score really held steady, but now nearly twice as many states fall into the bottom third of scores. And a lot of that has to do with how much funding they transferred over the life of the program, because that is a cumulative indicator that we've been looking at since the program started in 2013. A couple of other reflections are that states in the Mid-Atlantic score above average. And on a really positive note, scores for awarding and obligating transportation alternatives is improving. So when we look back at our data from 2018, only 10 states had obligated more than 60% of their TAP funding, and that has now grown to 31 states. So states are competing out this money and getting it out the door. And then on the negative side, more states are transferring funds away from transportation alternatives, which is something that changed in the infrastructure law. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to name one other positive indicator, which is that states that are using an equity consideration, so considering high-need communities and prioritizing them in project selection, that grew to 24 states, which is excellent. I've got a map that we can show you which states are doing that. Quick reflection on state funding. So this was the first year that we were able to compare. Last year, we just provided a snapshot. And so this year, the 2-year annual average for state spending on active transportation rose, as did per capita spending. And the number of states using their own money on walking and biking remained steady at 31 states. So I mentioned we wanted to just quickly show you a map of the states that are prioritizing high-need communities within transportation alternatives. And when I look at this, so the states in purple are those that define and prioritize high-need communities. And when I look at this map, I'm really inspired by the fact that these states exist all over the country. Okay, that was a lot on state and federal funding. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about our third out of 4 core topic areas. So with this one, we're really focusing in on safe routes to school and looking at the funding and support that states can take to support safe routes to school, which, as hopefully you know, is an initiative to make it safer, easier, and more equitable for kids to walk, bike, and roll to and from school. So when we look at the map of overall scores for this core topic area, in general, we're pleased because we saw scores for safe routes to school funding and supportive practices increase from 2020 to 2022. though a couple of states saw really significant increases, which we think is always very exciting. It also shows us that there's a lot of yellow on this map. That's our lowest scoring area. So there's a ton of opportunity for improvement in this core topic area. Okay, so we're going to look at Massachusetts for this section, which landed in the top category, building speed, which with a total score of 37 out of total 40 possible points. We're so excited to share about this because Massachusetts has really done an exemplary job when it comes to state policies and practices to support and promote safe routes to school initiatives. So when you look at this, you'll again see that there are two subtopics to this topic area, and we'll go over each of them in a little more detail. So I'll talk about one of the subtopics and pass it back to Michelle. So the first subtopic is about funding for safe routes to school. And we look at 4 different factors to know whether safe routes to school programs have the resources that they need to operate effective and consistent programs. So the first one is that we look at whether a state provides special consideration to safe routes to school programs when they're making those federal transportation alternatives program awards. Some states do this through a funding set aside. They take, okay, this amount of money out of TAP specifically for safe routes to school. Some states do this by awarding extra points in TAP project selection to safe routes to school. Massachusetts got a 5 out of 5 here because they set aside transportation alternatives program dollars specifically for safe routes to school infrastructure project. The second indicator that we look at here is whether a state has created a revenue source for safe routes to school, or if they use other federal dollars that are not transportation alternatives, like highway safety improvement program dollars for safe routes to school. Massachusetts nailed it, got a 5 out of 5 here because they use state money to provide that 20% match for safe routes to school programs. The third indicator in this topic is looking at whether states allow funding for the non-infrastructure side of safe routes to school. So at the federal level, legally, states can fund both infrastructure and non-infrastructure, which together comprise the 6 E's of safe routes to school, using federal transportation money. But we also know that not all states choose to do that. Some states say, we are only going to fund physical improvements. And we know from research that it's really the combination of infrastructure and non-infrastructure that makes safe routes to school so effective. And so when we look at this, Massachusetts got a 3 out of 5 because they fund a statewide infrastructure program, and non-infrastructure is eligible for transportation alternatives program, but it doesn't get any special treatment within scoring for that program. And then the last indicator in this section is a new indicator, and we look at whether a state provides planning grants or mini grants, which can really help get new schools or schools in lower income neighborhoods started with safe routes to school. And Massachusetts gets a 2 out of 3 here because they provide mini grants, but not planning grants. And now I'll pass it back to Michelle. We'll talk about supportive practices for safe routes to school.
Thanks, Marisa. So our second subtopic area in this area examines what types of support a state provides for safe routes to school outside of funding. So the staffing and technical assistance and other resources really helps ensure that safe routes to school initiatives on the ground are based upon best practices and tailored to local needs. So we look at 4 different aspects here. First is the state staffing for safe routes to school programs, either with state employees or by hiring consultants. Massachusetts got the full points here because they actually have more than 2 full-time safe routes to school dedicated staff. We also recommend that states provide a resource center or technical assistance to really support local safe routes to school initiatives. And so you'll see here that Massachusetts got full points here for providing that. Within this indicator, we also look at whether or not the state has developed curricula that can be used in local classrooms to support safe routes to school efforts. And so Massachusetts also has that, so they got full points here. Our third indicator here is actually a new indicator, and we looked at whether or not the state has adopted a Safe Routes to School plan or incorporated safe routes in a state active transportation plan. And this really helps solidify safe routes to school as a part of the state's, policies and initiatives and planning, and elevates it so it's a distinct component of the work at the state level. And so Massachusetts got 5 points out of 5 here. And our last indicator here is whether or not the state supports equitable access to safe routes to school planning. And this is providing resources from the state to enable different groups of students to access safe routes to school programming, whether that be English learners, students of color, students with disabilities, providing those resources to make sure that the local programs include and can serve them. And the Massachusetts Safe Routes to School program has developed some of these resources. So they have 5 out of 5 points here. So some reflections over the Safe Routes to School topic area. As Marisa said, overall scores in this core topic area increased from 2020 to 2022, which is really positive. Some really good notes. We're pleased that more states are prioritizing funding for Safe Routes to School. The number of states using state or federal non-transportation alternatives funds for Safe Routes to School held steady at 13 states. And collectively, these states are dedicating $36.5 million to Safe Routes to School. So it's a large amount of money. We saw a huge increase in the number of states allowing non-infrastructure Safe Routes to School projects and programs to be funded with TAP funding. So 34 states now allow it. This is up from 23 in 2020. However, that means that there's 17 states out there who still do not fund Safe Routes to School non-infrastructure programming using TAP funding. So this is a way that we can really increase the impact on the ground is by making those non-infrastructure dollars available. In terms of other areas of needing improvement, we saw that just over half of the states have at least one full-time Safe Routes to School coordinator or staff person. Obviously, we want to see that position available and that role filled in every single one of the states. About half of states have developed curricula or lesson plans for Safe Routes to School. That's another opportunity for improvement to get that in every state. And we would also love to see more states develop those materials to improve equitable access to Safe Routes to School. There's only 16 states who have developed those resources to help local programs reach underserved demographic groups. We'd love to see that across the board as well. So turning to our last core topic area, which is active schools and neighborhoods. This is sort of the area where we turn from transportation-related policies to policy and funding supports for kids and families to be active in their neighborhoods, to have access to space for physical activity, and to be active at school. So when we look at the map here from 2020 and 2022, we generally actually saw scores in this core topic area decrease. And part of this is because we did see some indicators, but part of it is really due to shifts in state policy and practices that sort of fell away from supporting these areas. We had 24 states, so almost half our states in the lowest category of lacing up, and none in the highest category of building speed. So this is, again, an area where we'd love to see change and improvement. So for this core topic area, we're going to go look at South Carolina, which scored 26 out of 45 points in the core topic area, putting it in the making strides category. We're going to look at the 3 subcomponents of this: shared use, school siting, and physical education in a little more depth. So first subtopic is the shared use of school facilities. Here we look at whether or not the state has adopted a policy either requiring or supporting shared use of school facilities, essentially opening up those playgrounds, those field spaces for recreational use by community members outside of school hours. We also look at whether or not the state is providing funding or other incentives like technical assistance to help those local communities set up shared use agreements, open those facilities, and address any challenges or fears that come along with shared use. So South Carolina has adopted a policy that recommends shared use, but doesn't require it. So they receive 6 out of 10 points. And they actually do provide technical assistance and training for local communities to implement shared use. So they received 5 out of 5 points on the providing funding incentives and support. Our next subtopic area here is school siting and design. And these are really looking at state policies that affect where schools are located and how they do or do not support walking and biking to and from those schools. So we looked first at whether or not states require large school sites or this minimum acreage guidance for new schools, which is actually an area where the state can earn negative points. So by requiring a large school site that often pushes schools to the edge of communities, away from neighborhoods, making them further from students and really prohibiting walking and biking. So for the states that do have that in place, they actually received negative points. South Carolina does not have a minimum acreage guideline. So they received 0 points, which is actually good in this indicator. We also look at whether or not state design guidance for schools has things that support walking and bicycling and physical activity. So here they can include things like criteria that encourages walking and biking and talks about safe routes to school, co-locating school sites with parks or other community destinations, looking at whether or not they have a maximum acreage requirement, and also requiring a minimum amount of school space to be devoted to playgrounds and other physical activity spaces. So this indicator is worth 15 points, and the state can receive points for various components of that. And so South Carolina actually has criteria that encourages walking or biking considerations in their school design and requires minimum amount of the school site to be devoted to playgrounds and outdoor physical activity space. So they received 9 out of the 15 points here. Our last area here looks at physical education and the opportunity to provide or for children to receive and partake in physical activity during the school day. We looked at whether or not the state requires physical education, how many minutes of physical education are required for each grade range, and whether or not physical education is required as a part of graduation requirements. And we align our indicator with national guidance and recommendations for physical education overall. So in this core topic area, South Carolina has met some of the requirements, but not all. So they received 6 out of 15 points. So moving into some reflections in this core topic area, as I mentioned before, the states can have shared use policies that either recommend or require shared use. The number of states with shared use policies actually hasn't changed since 2018, but we did see one state move from recommending to requiring shared use, which was good. The number of states with incentives or other technical assistance or resources to support developing shared use agreements and getting that implemented on the ground actually decreased. Although some of the funding incentives, I think, were tied to particular grant programs, and we've seen sort of fluctuation over time. So hopeful that those will come back. Here's a map that shows the school siting indicators, because this is an area where we see great improvement potential for those 13 states, those without a hatch, that have that really detrimental large minimum acreage requirement. And then, a lot of opportunity for other states to add positive factors into their school design guidance, such as considering walkability and bikeability. And then in terms of PE, we saw some really small changes since 2020. 2 states have updated their requirements and now align the number of minutes required with physical education recommendations. However, no state is actually receiving the full points for this indicator, and the vast majority are receiving 3 or fewer. So another area for improvement. I'm going to quickly run through some like overall reflections and actions and then move into Q&A. So as we said before, most states are still in the middle categories. We saw that upward shift in scores, which was really great since 2020, and really, again, want to recognize New Jersey and Massachusetts for achieving that highest scoring category for the first time. As we've sort of noted throughout, in every region of the country, there was at least one state with a fairly high score. And every state has at least one area where it's taken considerable action and has gotten a lot of points. But every state also has an area where they have the opportunity to do more. So we would love to empower that change. Along with the report, we have 2 fact sheets. One that gives you kind of a quick snapshot to help you understand the scoring system and all the indicators and points. And the other one is how to use your report cards. And we really recommend, if you're interested in digging in here more and making a change in your state, to choose 1 or 2 areas where your state could improve. Look at areas where the points are low, but you could see your state making changes, considering, what's the political environment, where are stakeholders invested, what other initiatives are going on that you could potentially leverage. And then we really encourage you all to connect with partners and help your state improve its score. All right. Before we move to Q&A, also want to let you know that this will be recorded. And we'll have the recording on our website, so you can share with others, refer back to it. And if you have like very specific questions about your state, either on the indicators, the scoring, or ways that you can make progress on ideas for making progress in your state, feel free to reach out to Marisa and I. Our contact information will be on the follow-up email as well. All right, I'm going to move over to Q&A. All right, so the first one I saw in the question box, I'm going to paraphrase this. Coming from a state that is in one of the bottom categories, could you talk about recommendations on how to create shift for states like mine to move out of this category and to higher ones? So yeah, I think referring back to that fact sheet that's talks about how to make change in your state. Again, looking at where your state is falling short on some of the points, identifying those areas that you might want to focus in on, because the report cards do cover a lot of topic areas, and don't anticipate or recommend that anybody try to focus on all of it. So really identifying what you think are the areas that are both needed, but also that you could see potential for change in your state and working there. And like I said, if you'd like to talk through like your state specifically and ideas or strategies, feel free to reach out to us. Marisa, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with everything that Michelle is saying. And I would also just encourage folks to learn about the opportunities within the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we have a lot of materials on our website. There's so much new funding available and policy changes that can help states make the changes where like they could use some improvement based on the state report cards. When we look at that, especially in core topic areas 2 and 3, almost all of them to improve your score that can be paid for with new money available in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so I think that's a really unique opportunity. For so many years, we've been advocating like, oh, we need more money. And as folks that care about safe routes to school and walking and biking, we've had to both like make the case that this matters and make the case for money. And I think we're in a unique time right now where there's a ton of new funding available and some hospitable policy changes to support this. And so now it's more about elevating the desire for these changes using the new money.
Yeah, thanks, Marisa. Let's see, we got a question regarding the data behind the report card. Yeah, so the data comes from a lot of different sources. I will try to give you a quick summary, but also share that in the actual report itself, where we describe each indicator, we also cite the data sources. So you can see for each specific thing where it's coming from. But in general, the information is gathered through a handful of ways. First, looking at what is sort of published databases or information online. Our staff did that research. And then for the vast majority of the indicators, we followed up with the state agency, whether that's Department of Transportation or the state health department, to confirm the information.
I just put a link, or just put more information in the chat. So as Michelle mentioned, it's all in the report. There's a section called "Where did the data come from?" for each core topic area. So you'll be able to see in there. And then also in the footnotes, we try to provide even more detail if there's ever more explanation needed about where the data come from.
Yeah. I see Nicole's comment / question. Is it a possibility to hear from some of the states and in future webinars that scored in the highest categories? Yes, we would love. And I know some of those folks are on the webinar today. So yeah, we would totally love to feature some of those states and have them share their best practices and thoughts and how they got there. Yeah, if there's additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box or the question box. I do see one question in the question box that might be a little unrelated to this webinar, but I'm going to answer it. Are there plans in the works for another national Safe Routes to School conference? So a couple things. We, Safe Routes Partnership, will be hosting a virtual Safe Routes to School Summit this November. And information for that will be coming out shortly. So we hope you'll save the date and join us for that virtual week. We'll have both networking discussion sessions as well as panel presentations, everything in a virtual format. And then in-person conference, we're really looking forward to having that maybe next year or the year after, depending on the state of the world. But yeah, we would love to see all in person. All right. Well, if there's no additional questions, after this webinar, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording, the presentation slides. You'll have my contact information, Maurice's contact information if you want to follow up on anything, as well as a survey. And we would really appreciate you taking the survey and helping us improve and expand upon our content for future webinars. So with that, thank you all.